1. The Bitemark Case. In 1982, a murder trial in Newport News, Virginia, dubbed the Bitemark Case, turned into a media sensation as the community heard dentists describe how they compared bite marks on the victim's legs to molds of the defendant's teeth. Police had struggled to solve the case until the dentists stepped in. One of the dentists later recalled that bite mark analysis was new at the time, which helped to explain the public fascination. 25 years later, I was looking through transcripts of old murder trials in Virginia, from dusty-bound volumes pulled from law library shelves. I wanted to read how forensic experts testified in trials back in the 1980s and 1990s. I found 24 trials, and while many had problematic forensic testimony, one stood out because it involved such unusual testimony. It was the Bitemark case, the trial of Keith Allen Harward, a death penalty case in which 6 different dentists ultimately concluded that Harward bit the victim's legs repeatedly. They were all wrong. In the early morning, a man broke into a home near the Navy Yards in Newport News, Virginia. He beat a man inside to death with a crowbar and then repeatedly raped his wife. During the assault, he bit her thighs and calves. She survived, called the police, and they swabbed and photographed the bite marks. She was unable to identify the person who assaulted her. It was dark in the house at the time, but she described him as a white male wearing a white sailor's uniform with 3 nested V's, the insignia of an E-3 naval sailor. The USS Carl Vinson, a nuclear aircraft carrier, was under construction in the nearby yards, and it had thousands of E-3 sailors on board. Keith Harward was one of them. In perhaps the most massive dental dragnet ever conducted, dentists examined the teeth of every one of the Navy sailors on board the USS Vinson. About 3,000 sailors took turns assembling in the mess hall, as 2 dentists shined flashlights in their mouths, looking for a telltale rotated tooth. The dentists examined Harward's teeth once, and they called him back to take a mold of his teeth. When they first compared his teeth to the marks on the victim, they excluded him. Tellingly, the gauntlet, as Harward referred to that ordeal, turned up no leads. Normally, we go to a dentist to clean and treat our teeth, not to solve crimes. But starting in the 1970s, a band of dentists started to sideline in criminal cases for extra pay and a chance for a star turn in the courtroom. Dentists had long matched pristine molds of teeth to identify human remains. This new group of dentists, however, claimed to be able to match skin markings where an assailant bites a victim to a mold of a suspect's teeth. Because they testify in court and help with criminal cases, these dentists are known as forensic odontologists. The odontologists who testified in Harward's case could not have been more confident in their conclusions. Although they cleared him during the shipboard gauntlet, at trial the dentists reported that the bite marks all matched Harward's teeth. The methods of forensic dentistry. One use of forensic dentistry is to identify human remains. Teeth are extremely durable, and even in terrible accidents, they may be quite well preserved, when skin tissue, fingerprints, and facial features are not. Such post-mortem forensic work can be far more reliable because the dentists may have a small, defined group of deceased people they are trying to tell apart. With complete sets of teeth to work with, dentists can conduct careful examinations, comparing X-rays of the deceased person's teeth with dental records of known people on file. Prior to the early 1970s, that is what forensic dentists did. They did not examine bite marks on human skin, which are far more difficult to compare. We only bite with our front teeth. A bite makes marks on irregular surfaces. For those who have been around teething toddlers who had a biter phase, You know all too well that bites may not leave a clear mark. They can look like big red bruises. While few crimes involve macabre biting situations, murders, child abuse, and assault cases can sometimes have bite mark evidence. The move toward using bite mark comparisons in the courts began with the case of People v. Marks, a California murder trial in 1974. A UCLA School of Dentistry professor, along with two other experts, examined an oval-shaped laceration on the victim's nose. They believed it was a bite mark. The professor explained that he would not normally testify about a bite mark because it is so difficult to make a reliable comparison. This case was an exception, however, because the defendant's teeth were so unusual. The marks were particularly well preserved and defined in 3 dimensions because nasal tissue is stretched so tightly. The professor said that this was the best bite mark he had ever seen. The judge let the experts testify, even though it was novel to compare bite marks. The appeals judges agreed that this was appropriate expert evidence. That ruling was then relied on by judges in state after state, who more broadly agreed to let bite mark experts take the stand. These experts did not limit their work to post-mortem identification of remains or the rare case with an exceptionally well-defined bite mark. In 1976, they organized the American Board of Forensic Odontology, ABFO, as a professional group. Dentists began to testify that they could determine whether bite marks were a match. The most famous bite mark case was the trial of serial killer Ted Bundy. Bundy bit one of the 3 victims he raped and murdered at a sorority at Florida State University in 1987. He was largely convicted on the strength of the bite mark comparison, and then executed in 1989 by Old Sparky, the Florida electric chair, in 1989, after confessing to committing dozens of other murders. Apparently, Bundy had unusually crooked teeth, making his bite marks distinctive. The prosecutor showed the jurors blown-up photographs of the bite mark evidence at Bundy's trial. At the time of the trial, less than half of the states allowed bite mark evidence in court. But by the end of the 1990s, all 50 states permitted it. Yet there was more fiction than truth in what forensic odontologists were doing. How to compare bite marks. A bite mark comparison proceeds using fairly simple and common-sense steps. The examiner takes photographs of the bite marks themselves and then enlarges them. If the victim's body still has indentations from the bite marks, a mold of the bite mark may be made for a 3-dimensional comparison. Today, a bite mark can be swabbed and DNA tested. However, if there is not enough saliva present, no DNA result may be possible, and a dentist may then examine the marks. The dentist first examines the mark to determine whether it came from a human bite. That can be a challenging step. If it is a post-mortem examination, there may be substantial contusions or bruising on the body, or decomposition, making it hard to determine whether some of the marks came from a bite. If the dentist concludes it was a human bite, the dentist then tries to determine whether it was upper or lower teeth that made the bite, and further to isolate which specific teeth made the bite. Next, the dentist obtains a mold of the suspect's teeth. The dentist visually compares the two to look for similarities or differences. The dentist will sometimes overlay photos from the victim with the mold of the defendant's teeth. The dentist will sometimes look at the bite mark and dental mold side by side. The dentist will sometimes use computers to enhance or blow up images. There is no single accepted way for a dentist to do this comparison work. In troubling cases, dentists have put the molds of the suspect's teeth on the victim's body, raising the question of whether they were creating new marks to match their target. What do the forensic dentists look for when they are comparing the bite mark to the dental mold? They say that they are looking for features that are not apparent to the naked eye. They note that humans normally have 30 teeth, each with surfaces to compare, with an enormous amount of variation among them. People can also have features like missing teeth, braces, dentures, or prosthesis, fillings, chips or cracks, or uneven bite motion. As a dentist explained in Keith Harward's trial, you have accidental characteristics, like wear patterns and breakage and things like that, which made the teeth unique and individual. There are several assumptions underlying this technique. First, there is the basic assumption that there is something unique about human dentition. Are all of our teeth different? How different? This question has never been empirically tested. There have never been analyses of large databases of teeth. No one has measured how common or rare it is to have any particular features in teeth. There are no statistics on how often people share characteristics in their teeth. The National Academy of Sciences, in its important 2009 report, concluded that there needs to be more research to confirm the fundamental basis for the science of bite mark comparison. They said that it has not been scientifically established that human dentition is unique. Second, it has not been scientifically established, the National Academy of Sciences explained, whether or not teeth can uniquely or reliably transfer information to human skin. We bite with our front teeth. Those front teeth tend to have fewer features than the chewing and grinding teeth in back, which have more complicated crowns. The incisors in the very front tend to leave straight, rectangular-shaped marks. The neighboring canine teeth tend to make triangular bites. There is a question of how distinctly those front teeth can transfer a pattern to human skin. Most teeth do not make contact during a bite. In fact, there can be so little information in a bite mark that dentists face real challenges determining whether a given bite was made by a human or an animal. Researchers asked forensic dentists whether they could agree that a bite was human, and they rarely agreed. Human skin is very elastic. Bite marks on the skin change over time and can be distorted by the elasticity of the skin, the unevenness of the bite surface, and swelling and healing. A third problem, as forensic dentists euphemistically put it, is that a biting situation can be dynamic, with quite a bit of moving around by the biter and the bitten. There will be distortion, depending on movement or the uneven surfaces involved. There will be differences between the shape of the teeth and the shape of the bite marks. How those differences should be interpreted is unknown. In fact, dentists have admitted that there will always be some differences between a bite mark and the biter's tooth molds. Yet there is no standard for how many differences it takes to say that a suspect could not have been the biter. More fundamentally, there are no standards for the features that a bite mark examiner looks for. The method itself is not clearly defined. How many and what quality of individual characteristics must be observed to call the bite a match is unknown. Cases have cited as few as 8 points of comparison to as many as 50 or more. How much one has to see to declare a match is unknown. There had been an effort in the 1980s to come up with a scoring system to assess bite mark accuracy, but it was abandoned. The entire process is vague, subjective, and depends on the experience and the judgment of the dentist. Yet the community of forensic dentists commonly testified with certainty that a single person's teeth made a mark, a positive identification. For decades, the ABFO instructed that dentists could conclude that a bite mark matches a criminal defendant with a virtual certainty, no reasonable or practical possibility that someone else did it. These guidelines did something even more remarkable. The ABFO actually put in writing that dentists could make their conclusions more aggressively if a lawyer tried to question them in court. The guidelines said that it was acceptable to state that there is no doubt in my mind or, in my opinion, the suspect is the biter, when such statements are prompted in testimony. Despite manifest flaws, No judges meaningfully questioned this evidence. Bite marks on trial. One dentist testified to a very, very, very high degree of probability those teeth left that bite mark, referring to Keith Harward's teeth. 3 times very must be a really good match. The prosecutor asked him to say more. The dentist said, "My conclusion would be that with all medical certainty, I feel that the teeth represented by these models were the teeth that made these bite marks." "There are no differences?" asked the prosecutor. "I found absolutely no differences." The prosecutor then asked him to tell the jury what reasonable medical certainty means. The dentist explained, "I don't know what all of the teeth in the world look like, one to another, but we know from reading and studying that we've never had 2 people who have had the same teeth marks or same alignment of teeth, much less getting into the individualized characteristics within a tooth. So with that knowledge, we realized that from a practical standpoint, all medical certainty means that there is just not anyone else that would have this unique dentition." Next, a second dentist testified that it was a practical impossibility that someone else would have all the characteristics in combination. Again, the prosecutor asked him to elaborate. He said that he had found, with reasonable scientific certainty, Mr. Harward caused the bite marks on the leg. "No discrepancies?" the prosecutor asked. "No, sir, it's a practical impossibility that someone else would have all these characteristics in combination." The prosecutor asked, "If you look hard enough, could you find someone with similar teeth, theoretically?" "I sincerely doubt that," responded the dentist. This testimony was incredibly forceful. Studies suggest that people react very positively to experts who express great confidence in their conclusions. People tend to assume that confident experts must be correct. Indeed, jurors also focus on body language or nonverbal cues for confidence, such as whether an expert keeps fixed eye contact, good posture, remains positive, and uses assertive mannerisms like leaning forward. Jurors care about how trustworthy and likable the expert appears. Credentials also really impress jurors. In one of the most realistic mock trial studies conducted on forensic experts, Jonathan Kohler, N.J. Schweitzer, Michael Sachs, and Don McQuiston found that the expert's background and experience really mattered. Jurors cared more about the background and experience of the forensic expert than whether the method the expert was using was actually scientifically tested. The second dentist not only spoke with utter confidence and apparent deep knowledge, but was internationally renowned. He had helped to convict Ted Bundy and joined in the investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He was a founding member of the ABFO, the professional group to which forensic dentists belong. The ABFO certifies forensic dentists as diplomats of the group. He served on a delegation to identify remains of Tsar Nicholas II and disappeared victims of the military regime in Argentina. More prominent still, he had been president of the American Academy of Forensic Scientists, which has 6,700 members. "The jury was just slobbering. They were gone. He was like the Wizard of Oz. He levitated," said Harward, recalling what it was like when the dentist recounted his credentials. The dentists said that Harward had unusual and distinctive characteristics on his teeth. One of his teeth canted sideways, and there was a hook-type area that seemed to match the bite mark. There was a chipped area and a breakage that aligned perfectly, they said. There were no discrepancies. The defense lawyer pointed out that there was a big discrepancy, a gap between 2 of Harward's teeth that was nowhere to be seen in the bite marks. The second dentist dismissed this out of hand. "What you're doing, you're making an error," he said condescendingly, calling it the type of mistake that, what I call well-meaning amateurs make. Testimony like this does more than link evidence right to the defendant. It also dehumanizes the defendant. As Innocence Project lawyer Chris Fabricant puts it, a prosecutor can say that the defendant was an animal who bit that poor victim, and science says so. In Harward's case, the prosecutor closed by telling the jurors that doubt vanishes when you have experts who tell you, within reasonable scientific certainty, the teeth that made these molds made the bite on the victim's legs. The jury convicted Harward in September 1982 and sentenced him to death. Due to a legal problem with the capital murder statute at the time, the Virginia Supreme Court sent the case back for a new trial. In 1986, Harward was convicted at a second trial and sentenced to life without parole. DNA exoneration. At around the same time that I came across Keith Harward's records by chance, he had written to the Innocence Project at Cardozo Law School in New York City, seeking DNA testing to prove the dentists wrong. Harward had given up on appeals and post-conviction challenges 20 years before. He had accepted that he would die in prison as an innocent man. Another inmate, though, told him about the Innocence Project, and he sent a letter. The Innocence Project took his case and obtained access to crime scene material for DNA testing. The swabs taken from the victim in multiple places all shared a single male DNA profile. That profile belonged to another person, who also had been a sailor on the USS Vinson. That man, the actual culprit, died in prison in Ohio over a decade before, while serving time for burglary and kidnapping. Harward was released in 2016, aged 60, after 33 years in prison. He saw his brothers in person the day he was released, for the first time in over 30 years. What went wrong? We now know that not only were the dentists making exaggerated claims, but they were flat out wrong that all of those details matched Harward's teeth. What are the chances that 6 dentists separately reached the same false conclusion? They may have all been biased by pressure from police and by each other. Before his first trial, Harward had been arrested in an altercation with his girlfriend, where she grabbed him and he bit her arm. She dropped the charges, but the police and prosecutors clearly decided he was a biter, and that may have encouraged the dentists to change their story to fit what the prosecutors wanted, a conviction. The dentists knew about each other's work. They convicted an innocent man and let a murderer go free. Yet at the time, the Bitemark case was celebrated as a triumph of forensics. Harward is not the only person exonerated by DNA who had been convicted based on bite mark evidence. There have been 10 so far. Roy Brown was convicted of murder in upstate New York and suffered 15 years in prison before DNA exonerated him. At his trial, a bite mark examiner told the jury to a reasonable degree of dental certainty that his teeth made the mark, and called differences inconsistent but explainably so. Willie Jackson spent 16 years in prison in Louisiana based on a bite mark match, before DNA testing finally exonerated him. Ray Crone was sentenced to death in Arizona after 2 dentists found a match. As one explained, that tooth caused that injury, and it was Ray Crone's teeth. Crone had his conviction reversed, and then was convicted a second time based on the bite mark evidence. He was exonerated by DNA tests after 10 years in prison. He had been widely dubbed the snaggle-toothed killer, and he did have distinctive teeth, but years later DNA testing identified the actual culprit, who had fairly normal-looking teeth. The dentists respond. In February 2017, Keith Harward attended the annual meeting of the American Association of Forensic Sciences. "I'm not here to make any friends," said Harward, at a workshop with forensic dentists titled Taking a Bite Out of Crime and Other Hairy Situations. Harward lashed out. "This bite mark stuff is bogus. Why even continue with it? It just doesn't make sense. 34 years thinking, wow, what just happened? He said of his convictions. You're taking people's lives in your hands and guessing, well, I say it is so, so it's got to be. Harward asked, so why do it? The only explanations that Harward could offer were money and ego. In 2018, the American Board of Forensic Odontologists did make a few changes to their guidelines. The dentists recommended the use of a dental lineup, so bite marks are not compared only to a single suspect, but rather to a series of dental samples. They said there should be independent verification by another dentist before making a final report. They emphasized that the strongest conclusion a dentist can reach is whether the teeth can or cannot be excluded as having made a mark. Meanwhile, I will describe in this book how judges continue to let this evidence in. In fact, some forensic dentists have branched out, providing immigration officers with conclusions based on X-ray images that a young person detained is in fact likely an adult and should be moved to adult detention. Young people arriving at the border may not have documentation. It really matters whether the person being detained is 17 or 18, because minors are housed in shelters to be reunited with family member sponsors and receive special legal protections, while adults are kept in prison-like detention centers. There is no research on statistics and the sizes of people's teeth that could actually allow one to tell the difference between a 17 and 18-year-old. In 2008, Congress enacted a law, the Trafficking Victims Reauthorization and Protection Act, forbidding use of bite mark forensics to determine age in immigration decisions. A federal audit emphasized, using radiographs of a person's bones or teeth cannot produce a specific age due to a range of factors affecting an individual's growth. A few judges stepped in to reject decisions based on dental comparisons, noting how unsupported such analysis is. For example, in 2016, a federal judge found immigration officers were continuing to use dental X-rays alone to send children to detention. A new Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE handbook, says that dental exams should be used only as a last resort. One dentist responded that the techniques being used by the dentists employed by ICE are very subjective and should not be used in cases of life and liberty. To this day, however, young people may still be put into adult detention based on dental comparisons, and in 2019, lawyers challenged a number of additional cases in habeas proceedings. So, to summarize, dentists in the 1970s began to say things never said before about human teeth. They reached aggressive conclusions based on their subjective opinions in life and death cases. One after another, judges fell into line and found the evidence admissible. To this day, dentists still make bite mark comparisons, although they may temper conclusions, and judges still let these comparisons in as evidence. Unfortunately, the same problems remain in a host of other types of forensic evidence. In the 1970s and 1980s, whether it was fingerprints, hair, fibers, tool marks, or bite marks, experts would testify in court that they found a match. They would claim 100% certainty in their conclusions, yet they could not explain their methods in any detail, and no research supported their aggressive statements. Keith Harward has this to say about the failure to seriously reform bite mark comparison forensics. This is a warning. If I find out anybody's testifying in bite mark evidence cases, I will come to the courtroom. I will contact the media. I will stand on the street corner in a Statue of Liberty outfit with a big sign saying, "This is crap."